This is Soundtrack Your Life. I'm Ryan Pack.
And I'm Nicole Barlow.
And this is the podcast where we talk to a guest about soundtracks that they feel connected to. Today we are talking to composer Robert Honstein. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So today we are going to talk about the 2021 Peter Middleton and James Spinney directed documentary, The Real Charlie Chaplin. So, Robert, you scored this film, and it was nominated for an Emmy. And the soundtrack was just released this past December.
That's correct. Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was a really amazing process to be a part of, and it was actually the first movie I had ever scored. So I felt really lucky to be a part of it, and I learned a lot and had a great time doing it.
Yeah, I just want to say it's incredible that this is your first film score. You were a really accomplished composer, obviously, so maybe this didn't feel intimidating for you, but was it a challenge walking into something that felt a little bit brand new for you?
It was terrifying. Are you kidding me? Oh my God. I actually feel like in a weird way, the pandemic, the timing of that helped me. So I initially got brought on board to the project in around January 2020. And we had these conversations and they were talking about their timelines. And the timeline at that point was basically like, all right, this film is going to go to festivals in summer 2020. And so we need the score to be done by it's like March or April or something. And I was like, yeah, cool. But in the back of my mind, I was like, all right, this is crazy. I was like, this is crazy. Like, I can't do this. But I wanted to do it. So I did it. So I said yes. But then, March happens and like everything grinds to a halt. And in a weird way, that gave me the breathing room, I think, to kind of figure things out with a little more time. So I don't know what it would have been like if that never happened, but it's sort of interesting timing how that worked. But yeah, there was a big learning curve for sure.
And then since you did a lot of the work in that kind of weird early pandemic time, were you trying to think of like creative ways to kind of get around recording but being, safe with
Yeah.
social distancing?
Yeah, I'm sure as everyone can remember, that was such a strange time for so many reasons. But in the context of this project, and it was strange also because it kept changing what was possible, right? Like, we didn't, the world didn't understand what it really was and how the protocols needed to be for like being safe and whatnot. And then as we got more understanding, those protocols evolved. So it was hard to even think about that initially just because nobody understood what was going on. And it was interesting. It affected the film in ways that were surprising. I mean, I was thinking about, yeah, the recording and musicians and whatnot, but the directors were like, we had to stop for a while because a lot of the archival materials, because it's a documentary about Chaplin that used a lot of archival materials, all of those archives, they closed too. So
Oh,
they had a cut of the film that was pretty close to finish, but it had a lot of placeholders for like archival film or that they were going to eventually get and drop in. So they were just waiting for things like that, and like other aspects of the production that I had never thought about. Like so many aspects were just like, we don't know what's going on. Sort of like pause. So everything was just paused. But we were able to work, like me and the directors, but just in the phase of like demos, which obviously we didn't need people necessarily. I was making some things, just myself. And but then, yeah, at a certain point, when it came time to record the score, definitely had to think about what was possible. At the time that we recorded it, which was, I think we recorded it in about March or April 2021, it was at a point where we could be in a room together, but we had to isolate. So, like, we couldn't, for example, do winds in the same room as other people. Like, the winds had to be in isolation, and we just recorded in a fashion where no one was ever there at the same time. We basically just layered it and isolated things, and that's just kind of how we had to do it, which actually was a good way to do. I mean, maybe we would have done it that way anyway, honestly. Like there's a certain advantage to recording that way because you have a lot of control when you isolate the different layers, and you can so it definitely affected a little bit, but I don't think it ended up not being too much of a negative. We were able to work around it. just wore masks all the time, had to go outside, take breaks, and just
Yeah, we've talked to other creative folks that have
yeah,
had projects during the pandemic, and
right,
that sometimes I kind of feel like we're a little bit of a time capsule for discussing how those things
yeah,
got made under
yeah,
some very weird
yeah,
conditions. I
yeah,
think all of us have kind of blocked out that period of time, but
yeah,
I was on productions during that sort of funky period too, and it changes a lot of how you work and forces you to rethink things and be
yeah,
really nimble.
yeah.
When they started giving you or the getting more of that archival footage and things about that cut started changing, did any of your direction have to change in response to that?
That was another thing. So, like I said, initially the extra time helped me, but then it actually hurt me. Or it wasn't hurt me, it's just sort of part of it. But just like there was so much extra time that it kind of allowed them to keep changing the cut. And so yeah, they did get that archival footage, but also more than that, they just had so much more time that they could kept rethinking things. And it just made for a much longer cycle of revisions and getting approvals, and then sometimes it would be like about the music, but a lot of time it was like, we decided to take this scene out of the film, or we decided to change the edit in this way
Mhm.
because we had this idea. And I think, I think ultimately it was all for the best, but it definitely, I felt that because there was so much more time, it just allowed them to like think about it and change their minds and try different things. So like, I definitely, that affected me for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then, timing wise, like, when you're composing for film or for screen, you're trying to fit your piece into the scene.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I assume a lot of your compositions, outside of film, like, you just you compose it until you feel like it's
Yeah.
finished, right? So
That's
how was
right.
that
Yeah.
difference?
So many differences. I mean, you mentioned at earlier that I have most of my background is as a concert composer. That's primarily what I do, and so obviously, I feel comfortable writing music, coming up with ideas, and creating pieces, and developing, and all that. That's fine. But in the film world, yeah, there's so many more sort of restraints and conditions that I have to consider. There's the time that you just mentioned, Ryan. There's also just thinking about attention, like if I'm writing a concert piece, I'm sort of like the whole story. Like people are listening to the music, and I can add so much more detail, that if I put that much detail, that many like sort of layers into the score, it becomes distracting, because there's voice and there's images and whatnot. So those were the two things that I felt like I had to learn the most as far as adjusting my writing, was yeah, that time thing, the structure is very different, and then the sense of like getting the focus right, like what's the good balance of like musical detail, musical information, but still like not pulling the viewer out of the visual storytelling, which is the primary thing because it's a film, so that was a learning curve for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you did a great job. I remember, when I started the documentary, I was like, it's noticeable, but it's not distracting.
That's great, and I mean, I will give a lot of credit also to the directors. I mean, they were so patient working with me, and, this is part of why I feel lucky, because I think I had directors that, well, first of all, they wanted to work with me, they were interested in my music, that's why they chose to work with me, but also they were very eager and willing to have a kinda dialogue about this, where it would, and so a lot of our conversations would actually ultimately center, once we got the basics, like the tone and the basic sort of map of the different beats in the scene, like these sort of basic things. The conversations oftentimes would center around, certain moments where it'd be like, maybe this might be pulling too much focus. Maybe we dial this
Mhm.
back, or like this little change or this little detail is drawing attention in a way that we find distracting. And so then I'm rethinking that. So I think there was a lot of work and a lot of back and forth to exactly that point, Ryan, which was, creating that balance between the music that we thought was interesting and telling the story in various ways, but also wasn't getting in the way, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I had
yeah.
to double, triple check myself and then with Ryan, "Are we sure this is his first score?"
Oh,
Because it's
that's
really effective and beautiful and I think delicate and not distracting, as Ryan
thank
said,
you.
which is really nice and I'm sure incredibly difficult to pull off. I think
Thank
one of the things that we were also kind of wondering is, how do you approach a subject matter like this, and how
you.
did the filmmakers kind of help you? Because Chaplin himself is this kind of like enigmatic
Yeah,
figure, and that's kind of the discovery or the journey of discovery of this documentary in essence, and was that part of the initial discussion is, how do you sort of capture some of that mystery? How do you
yeah,
demystify what instruments, can do that the best? What were
yeah.
those discussions like initially? How do you set it
Oh,
up?
that was so fast. I loved that part of it. I felt it was so cool to have a conversation like that with the directors, and we definitely talked about stuff like that. I mean, so they brought me in. I think it's pretty typical for composers. You get brought in pretty late in the process. They had been working on this film for a number of years. They had a not the final cut, but a pretty far along edit. So they had real clear ideas about what the themes were in this movie, what the way the themes were going to weave together. They had a very clear vision for the storytelling and the motives and the themes. And so we talked about that, and we talked about musical ways to express that. Um, and I think that was the initial conversation centered around that. And I guess we ultimately focused on this sort of chamber music approach because, well, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, but I do think, yeah, with Chaplin, he has this very interesting sort of public-private axis. He's this most famous person in the world, but nobody really knows who he is, kind of thing. And I think a lot of the film, I mean, the title sort of poses that question. It's you can't answer. It's a question you can't answer, obviously, but it's an interesting question to investigate. And I think a lot of the film is trying to peel back that onion and get a look at a different side of him as a family person, him, in his various private life, him and his insecurities, with his where he came from and how that translated to insecurities later in his life. So the idea, so with the chamber sound, I think that I felt like could create that sense of intimacy, that sense of like we are getting a look into something private, something a little more personal. And it also contrasts really nicely because there's a lot of other music, like music from the time, music from the films that happens, like, and that music is what you'd expect. It's like
Right.
this kind of have a much bigger dramatic like
Mhm.
orchestra. It's like
Right.
yeah, and so that's very public facing. It's very dramatic. It's very much part of the show, right?
Mhm.
Whereas I think my music is expressing this other side, which is a lot more personal, intimate sort of angle, I guess, to the story. And so I think going with a small chamber ensemble like we did, I think helped that. So that was part of I think the reasoning behind it. Yeah,
Yeah, so a really nice, like, smart counterweight because I think I went into this expecting, like, "Oh, it's Chaplin, it's gonna be kind of, like,
right,
bombastic in some way,"
right,
but it
right.
isn't at
Yeah.
all, so
Yeah, and I definitely like, initially when I was just starting, I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna listen to a lot of Chaplin music," and 'cause, I wasn't sure how this was gonna go, as far as what kind of things they're interested in. I was like, are they just gonna want me to sort of write, like, Chaplin sounding music? Like, and I wasn't super psyched about that idea, but I listened to a lot of it and got a sense of it. But no, I think that my music is a counterpoint, and that's part of the storytelling. It's like I always sort of my stuff. It's interesting if you look at the arc of the film. More, I have a bigger percentage of music in the back half, and I think that's because the first half there's an exposition, that's sort of telling the rise, so to speak. The exciting story that we all know. But then that kind of starts to turn as we start to get to more insights into his personal life and other aspects. And as that turn happens, I think more of my music is coming into it. So it's nice to have that counterpoint because in the sound itself, right? Because having that counterpoint in the sound itself, I think helps articulate that structure, that sort of shift that happens in the documentary. So yeah, I mean, I think that was I think I like that choice. That was a good idea. Yeah.
So I know that you listened to a lot of like Chaplin music was while you were getting ready for this project. How big of a Charlie Chaplin fan were you before you were brought in?
Yeah, I mean, no more than I think anyone else, which is to say I was, like, aware of him. I thought, "Yeah, Charlie Chaplin's great," and I think I'd seen a couple things and, it's funny. But, man, getting into this, like, totally, like, I watched a lot of the films, I read his autobiography, I read other books about it. I got way more immersed into it, and now I appreciate what he did a lot more. I mean, he's a complicated figure, not a perfect person by any measure. But I think as an artist, obviously a pretty incredible artist. And so now I would say I'm a fan. I would say I'm a fan at this point. Yeah, and it actually was interesting. My kids that was one thing that was very interesting 'cause, I had 2 children, well, now they're 8 and 6, but at the time they were younger, and occasionally I'd be working in my studio and, there would be, I'd have the film, the documentary open and I was working but there are parts of the documentary where it's just clips from Chaplin's film. So they would occasionally come in and see some clip of Chaplin and they just instantly thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
Like, which is amazing to me. It's like, wow, this is stuff is like gonna be over like 100 years old. And here's like a 4-year-old that walks in the room and is just cracking up. Like the connection was instantaneous. I was like, "This is so cool." You
I
know?
love that story, because it's so physical and
Yeah,
accessible, a lot of
yeah.
his comedy, so I feel like that's gonna translate time, and it's probably a
Oh,
testament
yeah,
to why he was such an and
yeah,
is such an enduring icon and
yeah,
figure. I
absolutely.
think we take him for granted a little bit, it's because
Yeah,
people, he's just always sort of been this larger than life figure,
yeah,
in
yeah,
Americana. So you almost
yeah,
don't even stop to figure out, who he was and the
yeah.
context of the time. So it's nice to have this film to kind of, unpack that for people. It's a cool thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm biased, but I'm a fan of the film, and I think it does a really good job of doing exactly that, which is, providing a kind of contemporary lens to bring us into that world, make us aware of his work and his persona in different aspects. So I think it does a really good job. Some people, if you're like a Chaplin scholar or something, like you're probably going to watch this and not get a lot of new information. But for most people, I think it's a really great introduction into him as a person and as well as his work. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was great in contextualizing, like, how popular he was. Like,
Right.
Right.
everyone knows the name Charlie Chaplin. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, of
Right.
course, he's a silent film star, and everyone knows
Yeah.
who he is." But, like, he was like the Beatles, he'd show up
Yeah.
in a city and everyone would go
Yeah.
nuts. Like, he
Yeah.
was that
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
corny to
Yeah.
be like he was like the Taylor Swift of, like, the
Yeah.
1930s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they make that point. He sort of was one of the first sort of truly global celebrities, that took advantage of these new technologies like film, obviously, and was a global celebrity in a way that I don't think quite had happened before. But I mean, also I think one of the things that was really resonated for me was getting into the family side of the story, and I think there were some family home videos,
Mhm.
interviews with the children that I
Mhm.
don't know if those had been released before. Some of those, and so that was I just I'm a dad and thinking about that is really touching actually to get this side of the story and hear some of the voices, especially of his children, talking a little bit about that. That was I thought that was really interesting to get a
Mhm.
little bit of that perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah. Also, it's I mean, yeah, the whole second half of his life when he's sort of like quote in exile. It's so interesting. He lived for a long time after he left the states, and he made a couple of movies in exile, but I think for the most part, the last 20 plus years of his life, he didn't make any more films, although he was sort of half working on things, and you just get the sense that he's was sort of haunted and never
Mhm.
really like let it go, even from his kids, sort of talking about that. It's very interesting.
So you were doing, concert composition beforehand.
Mhm. Yeah.
Obviously, you're excited about the opportunity to score a film. Do you have like film composer influences that you were kind of thinking of while you were working on this project? Or
Mm. Oh my gosh. Whew, I don't know if I could rattle off names of film composers, but I appreciate music in films, and classics and stuff like John Williams. Everyone talks about that, but also like the like modern things like the guy who just died so bad, who did the like Icelandic composer. Okay, I don't remember names. I'm so
I,
bad.
I know who you're talking
We
about.
Yeah,
know who you're talking about because we just
Johan Johansson, right?
yeah,
Johansson,
something
yeah.
like
Like,
yeah.
I love that kinda thing, like, the stuff that's, like, a little more minimal, but I also like, the more traditional stuff, but also, I mean, I think and this is maybe why they were interested in even working with me. I mean, I think some approaches that maybe aren't as conventionally, like, film score are
Mhm.
interesting. I think it's become a little bit more common for people from the concert world to sort of occasionally, moonlight in the film world, and I really like that, so I don't know. I don't have more specifics to say, but I appreciate the art form enormously. I mean, I think it's such a cool, like the interdisciplinary nature, the collaboration. It's just like it's really really amazing.
So it sounds like you were not necessarily like in like when you grew up as a musician and you got into music composition. It
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like film score was necessarily like the
No, no. So
the
like,
end
okay,
game for you.
right. That's a good point. Yeah, no, definitely not. I mean, I like anyone else who grew up, it's like ubiquitous. You hear score for film like everywhere, and of course it influences you. But I was, on a path, I would say, to become more of like a sort of like I was just more into like, first of all, I was more in the classical world, but then I got into other things like jazz and playing in bands and stuff. But I always was sort of more oriented in that kind of world that was like more about performance, more about sometimes experimental, sometimes not, but it was more about that, like the performance aspect, and either playing or listening in that live experience. Not to say I didn't appreciate or enjoy film, it just wasn't like a goal at all, really. And I mean, I have to say, as I in the last, say, 15, 20 years, I've become more aware of things and more appreciative and interested maybe in some of the music that's being created, but I never really imagined that I would be able to do it myself. And in fact, when they reached out to me, I initially thought it was spam. I didn't believe them. I'm dead serious. Like, the music supervisor email I had just, like, redone my website, and I had, like, a contact form, and the music supervisor emailed me through the contact form, and I was like, "Nobody uses the contact form." I was like, "This isn't real." And so, like, it took a while for me to be like, "No, they're serious. This is not a joke." Um, and I don't know. I mean, I feel like they took a chance. I mean, in hindsight, I'm kind of shocked because I feel like I could have gone poorly. But I mean, the music supervisor, she was so great, and the director was so great. I think it was just the right team. Like, these are people that really cared about music, and they wanted something a little bit different. They wanted something that was like a little bit more coming from my world. And yeah, so I think that all kind of set it up to work out. But I was as surprised as anyone when they reached out to me. And the music supervisor, she was like, think about this, like, you're gonna write like, it's gonna end up being like maybe 45, 60 minutes roughly of music. And you just think about, like, you're writing like a bunch of like a suite of a bunch of like little short pieces, and it's gonna be like maybe 4 or 5 like kind of theme, like sort of different thematic areas, and then there'll be elaborations on them. And like, it's like she sort of just coached me into like being less overwhelmed by the whole thing, and just like,
Mm.
because when initially you're like an hour long of music and like I have to do it in 2 months, like, what the heck? Like, this is insane. But she sort of like really was helpful in like making it, breaking it down into terms that was like more achievable, so that was helpful. But also I have friends, like I have some friends who started in more in concert and then went to the film route, and like are very active. And so I just through friends and colleagues, like I'm aware of like the process and the workflow. Like, I'm not, I mean, also I teach at NYU. I teach more in concert music, but they have a whole screen scoring program, a great program. And so there's other faculty there and students there, that so I've sort of like been able to, I didn't go into this completely ignorant, let's say. I have some awareness of what the process is like and what it entails. But yeah, it was very foreign. It was very different. But I love it. I mean, I don't have a film I'm working on now, but it's definitely something I want to do more of. Like, it was really fun, and I would like to do more of it. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, people have to email you via your website then.
Yeah, I will now write
Yeah,
back.
check your spam. Check your spam.
I
Check
will check
your
the spam. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great story. As kinda every creative's, dream and nightmare
Yeah.
simultaneously to get this really big opportunity, but with
Yeah.
people that you haven't worked with before. Do you know how the music supervisor connected with you or how she knew your work?
It's shrouded somewhat in mystery, but I do have, some theories, which is to say, they have, as most all films do, they have temp music, And I could tell from the temp music that a lot of it was kind of like from my world, so to speak. Like
Mm,
I recognized like a lot of composers that either I knew personally or were sort of cut from a similar cloth. So like I think they
mhm,
were already like focused on this kind of world of like contemporary classical music, and particularly like a lot of composers that I think were from a certain side of that scene, I guess you could say. So that's
mhm,
one. And then I actually do know that they had like gone through an earlier iteration about like what the score would be, where they had like talked to someone I knew, and they went a different direction, like really different. Like I don't even think it was about. I don't think it was about like the person I knew not working. I think it was like they just. It was like they were going to do like an all piano score at some point or something, and then like
mm,
the whole concept changed, and they wanted to do it anyway. But I sort of knew that like, and I pieced this together way after the fact. Like I kind of knew that, so I was just like, this person was poking around my world. Like I don't think if she was talking to the people I know they were talking to and aware of the thing. I don't think it would be too far to connect the dots and find that I exist at least, but other than that sort of like detective work on my own, like I actually don't really have a clear idea. I probably should just straight up ask her. I don't know. I always felt weird about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just felt weird while it was happening. I just didn't wanna kind of have that conversation, and now, I don't know, it just hasn't come up. I mean, I'm not, like, in close touch or anything, but I am a little curious, like, how did that ultimately turn come to me? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, using your compositions as temp tracks, maybe it's kind of maybe it was a thing. That
Well,
makes
they
sense.
didn't use
Maybe the very
my pieces, but they used pieces of people I knew very well.
mhm, okay.
It wasn't, yeah, no, 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 it wasn't like the temp had all me, like, well, if that was the case, then obviously okay. No, no, it was just that the temp was of, like, composers, like, I know that composer, I know that person, like, we're all in the same world, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Small
So,
world kinda deal.
So
yeah,
if they're using their music, they probably are aware of your music.
yeah, that's what I'm saying, exactly, like, they were already, like, sort of zeroing in, I think, on a kind of sound or a concept of, like, of what they think type of composer might be that could create their sound. I don't know. It felt very serendipitous. It absolutely felt very serendipitous, but, it was cool. I mean, I after it, I mean, I first of all, I learned that I had such a greater appreciation of what a composer does who works in media, but at the same time, I had a greater appreciation of what I get to do as a concert composer, and, I sort of was like, wow, this was so fun. But then by the time it was all done, I was like, I kind of just want to write like a string quartet and like nobody's going to tell me what to do. And
Right.
it's like, I mean, probably like, like 100 people will listen to it, but at least it's all me. It's like I'm
No one's
telling the
giving you
whole story.
notes.
Yeah, it's all so yeah, it's such an interesting dynamic, working in a film. You're part of a team, you're not the main decider, you're a voice in the room. But yeah, it's really different than concert where it's like, okay, yep, this is your piece. Like everything about it is like my choice.
So speaking of the temp track, how much did you kind of lean on what you heard on the temp track and what you composed, or like did you
Yeah.
disregard it or did you kind of use it as a guide?
All of the above. I mean, so it really went cue to cue, it depended. I mean, there were some cues where they themselves were just like, "Yeah, you should ignore the temp track. Like, we still have no idea what we really want here." And then there were a few cues, and in a way, these were the hardest ones, where they're like just so tied to it. They're like that it felt like my job became like, how do I do this but not do this?
Yeah.
Right.
um, so it really spans the whole range, I think I would say. I couldn't give a blanket statement about the whole thing. It was completely from cue to cue, like, depended. But yeah, there was examples of all of that. Yeah.
Can you recall what the most challenging piece of music in this sort of suite of music was for you?
In a funny way, the most challenging was not include is one that they ultimately didn't include.
Oh, that's
So
always how it is, isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
The hardest part.
and in a way, it was challenging because it was the least like me. So there's this one cue that, was basically what had to happen was it had to be Chaplin music, but the way the scene worked, it just wasn't possible to really just use his music. It had to be something new because of just the beats and the way things changed, and, like, it just kinda had to be composed. so we really struggled with, first of all, the question was, could it be something that was alluding to Chaplin, but not Chaplin? So maybe like a little bit like my voice, but still like kind of
Mm,
one foot in one foot in both worlds sort of approach. So we tried it that way. That didn't work. And then eventually it was like, no, 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 this really just kind of needs to sound like a Chaplin thing. And then it was sort of about an imitation kind of game. And like, so that was sort of challenging, obviously, like getting the imitation right. And then it was like, almost felt like a Frankenstein situation where it's like, here's 30 seconds, which is going to be Chaplin, and then here's 30 seconds, which has to be me because it needs to connect in a certain way.
mhm,
And so like we did all that and we figured it out and we even recorded it. But then at the very end, and it was in the cut, and I thought it sounded great, everything was great, but ultimately it became this problem with the rights. Because
mm,
Chaplin's rights are very complicated. There's all kinds of
mhm,
stakeholders. Like, so if the particular for the whatever particular thing for that particular music, we just couldn't they just couldn't get it. They like went down to the wire and they just couldn't get it, so they just had to take it out altogether. But we spent so much time on that thing. It was really, in hindsight, just like, I don't know, it's funny. We spent so much time on that thing. It's probably another example that's more just like my own music, but there was one called it's a cue called the Chaplin Studio,
mhm,
which is a fun one. It's basically quartet. For that one, I think it's mainly just string quartet. Yeah, there was a lot of work that went into the details of that, and we eventually got there. But then there was this interesting moment where they were like, I feel like it needs something, like it still needs like some other element. And I suggested a slide guitar, like a Hawaiian slide guitar,
mm,
because actually, right, like not too far before it, there was a scene where they actually were using like sort of Hawaiian source music,
mm,
which actually in the '20s was actually, like, really popular in the
mhm,
States. I don't know why, but for some reason there was, like, a fad about it. So it kinda made sense. So and I just so happened to so my grandmother had a slide guitar because she was a child of in the '30s, and I guess her dad, like, got her one, and because everyone was into Hawaiian music then, and I happened to have inherited it. She passed away, and I literally had it in my studio, and so that's why I was like, "Well, what if we just, put some of this in there?" And I can't really play it, but I sort of figured it out enough to, like, add a layer where it's just sort of, like, sliding around, and it kinda fits in the harmony of the quartet. So I recorded myself doing it, and it felt like we might have done it. It worked and people were into it, but they ultimately decided it was just, like, a little too quirky. That sort of whole question of that the focus, like, it's just, like, a little too weird that it, like, kind of didn't work. So we ended up taking it out, but I in the soundtrack album, I put it back in. And then a sort of fun Easter egg is that in the credits, this was just, I guess, like an inside joke between us, me and the directors. We actually, in the credits, when it listed the musicians, we did list myself as a slide guitar player in the ensemble, even though it wasn't in the piece. I don't know. It's just a random thing. Sort of fun.
that's cool, I love that. I love that you got to use grandma's,
I
Hawaiian.
like that I got to use it too. Yeah. I mean,
Great.
it wasn't in the film, but it's in the soundtrack. So
Yeah.
it's okay. Yeah.
There's a part in the documentary where it they talk about how difficult it was to do city lights,
Mm.
um,
Yes.
and how it was, years.
That
And
one was hard. Yes.
yeah, and I
That
was
cue
like,
was
did you kind of feel
yes.
like that was you at
Oh
some
my
point?
god, yeah. So that one was hard. That's called Edge of Madness. So that's another the soundtrack album, I think, has, like, about, I don't know how long, it's about 50 minutes, but there's a small number of cues, probably 3 or 4 other cues that we couldn't include on the soundtrack album because they are cues that more explicitly use Chaplin material, and we didn't it was too hard to get the rights to, like, release Chaplin material, even if I mean, they're just very strict about it. But the Edge of Madness, that cue that you're referring to, that basically took a sort of phrase from one of some Chaplin music, like, and kind of, used that as the basis for the cue, and it sort of tracks the way they tell the story of him just going crazy. Like, he took, like, I don't know, it's like a year and, like, hundreds and hundreds of takes. Like, I think he recast the main actress and, like, reshot the entire thing. Yeah,
And then brought her back.
and then brought her back, yeah, and all that. So, like, that was actually really hard too. Like, I remember working on that. I did remember thinking many times that I myself was on the edge of madness, trying to get that right. But yeah, we tried so many different sort of versions of the arrangement of how that worked and how the sort of builds of that music worked as it kind of underscored the scene and all that. Yeah, that was we couldn't include it on the soundtrack because it was too the material was too much like taken from Chaplin. But that was interesting, and also even recording that was tricky for various reasons. Like it definitely was. Yeah, that was a tricky one. It also was like one of the ones that were very timing sensitive. So this isn't it's not an action movie. It's a documentary. I mean the in and out is very important, and also the structure. You need to follow the structure of the film, but it's not like Tom and Jerry or something. It's not like you need this like super precise timing, but that one actually did have some moments where it really needed to be like, this is happening. This beat in the music is like right there with the cut. And so that yeah, that had its own challenges, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, did it take you a while to kinda get used to scoring to beats?
Yeah, it did, but you know, I sort of how do I put this? I realized that it really is just a handful of key moments. Like it's not like every single thing has to like line up in this way, but certain key things. And if those key things work, then it's like somehow everything else makes sense, right? And then I definitely learned some strategies for tweaking it. Maybe I'll write a musical phrase and okay, it's off by I don't know, 3 seconds. There's all kinds of ways, like whether it just even be just like, I'm gonna take this tempo like just slightly faster so that it lines up, or just add one beat right here, right there. So there's all kinds of little strategies that in a way that actually wasn't as hard because it frankly felt like closer to like my like modern music. Like we're gonna have a random like 5/8 measure here, or like I do that all the time. Like I'm always like messing up the so it's not but yeah, that became useful. There were certain cues like hit this one called Hitler Chaplin, where there was also another little comic beat where it's like the music had to stop right when this sort of like joke happened. It just had to time that way. Yeah, so yeah, I write a phrase, get pretty close, and then okay, maybe I got to take out an eighth note here, or you know, whatever, and nip and tuck, and then it kind of works out. But that wasn't that wasn't so bad. But again, it's not like I'm scoring like an action film where I think the precision is like a lot more. That feels like that would be a lot harder in a technical sense.
And I guess, on a technical level, did you have to tweak more, like, production-wise, so, like, what you were doing kind of seamlessly fit with, like, source music and stuff like that? Like, did you feel
Yeah,
like you're tinkering
we
a little bit more with that stuff?
there's definitely I like to think of it as these sort of subtle things that we did with the production. So going back to the choice of the sound, we went on this chamber music sound, right? But we also made a choice that it's mainly acoustic, right? There's so many scores that are heavily synth based or in some
Mhm.
other way, like with electronic sort of sounds, and that's awesome. And I love a lot of scores like that. But we wanted this to be primarily acoustic. And that actually goes back to the initial sort of conversation about what is the function of this score? What is the sound representing? And that sort of intimate, more personal side. So we felt like this acoustic thing was really the way to capture that. But there were still sort of subtle ways that we were thinking about the sound, like production elements. So like really thinking about the reverbs, really thinking about there were key moments where we'd sort of like work in a little bit of delay, and have some sort of echoes, and we did some fun things with like sort of subtle, like slowing some tracks down, like maybe 5 to 10%, like record it and then slow it down 5 to 10%, so it has just a slightly more
Mhm.
sort of I don't know, liquid sort of woozy quality, like especially towards the end with the like when he's older sort of stuff. Some fun things with like layering, like there were some of the more ambient sort of cues where it's just like a cloud of strings and maybe some light piano, where like I would record the strings like maybe 3 or 4 times with subtly different bowings or articulations and then kind of mix it together. I mean, we just had all these different things, which ultimately I think it still fundamentally sounds acoustic. It doesn't sound like electronic or overly
Mhm.
produced, but in subtle ways, it is occasionally like accessing these like slightly more produced or slightly more artificial colors for the purpose of the storytelling and whatnot. And I love that actually. That really spoke to my sensibility because I mean, I'm primarily an acoustic composer, so I'm much more comfortable in that, but I really like this idea of using tools in the studio, production tools to like take that fundamental acoustic sound, but warp it in subtle but affecting ways. So that was fun to work on that. Yeah, and we definitely talked about that kind of thing.
So, obviously, big honor, you were nominated
Hmm.
for the soundtrack for the Emmy. Did this also, come to your email and you thought it was a joke?
It did come to my email, but at that point, I didn't think it was a joke. So, yeah, so it was nominated for a news and documentary Emmy and Best Original Score, and basically, I didn't think it was a joke because I knew that they had submitted it because it was in the states. It was presented by Showtime, so it came out on Showtime, and they're like they have like they submitted it to various awards and whatnot. So I knew they had submitted it because I had to write a little like statement or whatever when they put the submission together. So they just email. It was an email. It was an email, but I didn't think it was spam because I had already knew they had submitted it and knew it was possible. But I was definitely shocked. I was just like, "What? That's crazy." But yeah, that was just like sort of like this special like icing on the cake sort of moment. Like I mean, I already had such an amazing experience, but it was just kind of nice to get a little bit of recognition on top of that. That was just amazing. I didn't expect that. But yeah, that was cool. I don't know. We didn't win, but I kind of I didn't care. Like it was just to get the acknowledgement was in itself really really humbling and gratifying. Was awesome. It was cool. So the ceremony was in New York. So the news and documentary one is in New York. The like primetime one that's the one in LA. But still,
Mhm.
it was really cool. I felt that it was the news and documentary because like, that I didn't know too much about the scene because I'm not really part of it. But like going to the ceremony and seeing all those people that are in that world of documentary filmmaking, especially, it was definitely struck by just like there's so much like passion and energy and people doing like really amazing things like going all over the world and to tell these stories and like yeah, I was pretty blown away by just being in the room and seeing the people that were doing, you kind of read about the different, they have like a
Mhm.
program you can read about, and I'm just like, this is like what a cool community of people that do that. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, I feel like the phrase labor of love gets tossed around really casually, but, within that universe of people, I feel like you have to have such passion for that to cut through just the issues that you touched on today
Yeah,
with rights and things, red
yeah,
tape that you need to cut
yeah,
through, going to bizarre places, spending
yeah,
years trying to uncover things that people
yeah,
haven't really
yeah,
unearthed yet.
yeah,
So I'm sure the process of getting this film made,
yeah.
was
Yeah, I
a
think it
big one.
it took a while. I mean, I think they were working on it for close to 5 years, honestly.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. I think I don't know the full story, but one of the producers somehow kind of got access to this archive, the family's archive of some of these videos and different materials. And I mean, at the core of the film was this interview that he had done towards not end of his life, but later in life when he was already living abroad with I think Life magazine, and I was never fully like they had the full audio archive of it, which had
Right.
never been released. So somehow I think it started with they had all this material, and then they went from there. But I think it was a very long process from that point to the film. Yeah, I'm definitely in awe of like just the commitment it takes to do this, to live with that, and the team of people that put that together. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, I think documentary film is a pretty exciting area these days, frankly. I think there's a lot of amazing films being made and a lot of kind of just new ideas about how to tell documentary stories. Like, I grew up if you said the word documentary, I would think like something you see on like just like maybe at school or like or like sort of standard like informational like PBS kind of thing, which is great. But like there's so many different versions of what that can be that I think are that's being made now. And a lot of interesting music too, actually, that's
Yeah.
coming through that world, which is kind of cool.
So, are there things that you learned during, the scoring process that you feel you've, brought over into your concert composition work?
Yeah, yeah. Great question. You guys have great questions, by the way. It's really wonderful. But yes, actually a lot. So that was one of the coolest things about I think doing this whole thing is that in learning a little bit about this process and writing the score and seeing how it worked, it definitely sort of shone like a fresh light on my work in the concert world. And I think that certainly some of the, I wouldn't say techniques, but like because in this documentary environment, I would often be in situations where I had to create versions of things very quickly. Like, even though, like I said, we had this extended time period, whatnot, the way it ended up unfolding would be like there were these sort of intense bursts. It'd be like, okay, for like 4 weeks, everyone's like on board and like fully engaged. And it's like we're working on things. And it'll be like, okay, we're gonna work on this cue. Okay, so I'll deliver like a draft like the next day. So it's like okay, wake up. I'm gonna write a cue today. Like gonna do the whole thing, and get them a demo of that. And then there'll be comments, and maybe in best case it's just small tweaks. Worst case it's like okay, I got to start over, new direction, write a new thing, and it just forced me to generate material a lot quicker and to just work with it differently than I would have in a concert sort of piece where like I just have this luxury of time and like I'm in the concerts, like I said, like it's nice to be the only person who's making the decisions in the concert piece, but at the same time that can lead to a sort of like analysis paralysis situation where it's like
Right.
there's so many choices and you're just like, oh, what if I did this, what if I did that? Whereas with the score thing it's like I have to make a choice and then I'm going to respond to what the director has to say about that choice. You know what I mean? That in a way sort of simplifies things. It's not like I can't just like just sit around thinking about it. I just have to be like, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and now I'm going to do it. I have to execute it, and then we'll have a conversation about it. So that type of working, I brought back a little bit. I find it a really great way to just generate ideas, to try different variations, and not be as precious with the material, and just say I'm going to try it different ways. But so that's one way for sure. I also think just like I loved sort of the way that the directors would just talk about storytelling and think about storytelling. And I think naturally in my concert pieces, I gravitate towards that idea of storytelling. Like I like to think that I'm sort of telling a story, even though if it's a very abstract one. But I don't think I'd ever thought about it in such sort of concrete terms or articulated the way they would talk about it. And I kind of really liked that. It shed an interesting perspective on the music. So I think I've taken a little bit of that kind of with me. And then sort of immediately was so for every, I would say, minute of score that ended up in the film, there may have been anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes of score that was left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. And I frankly have just like used a lot of that in different
Mm.
contexts, which was actually very, very cool because it felt like, in a way, there was a nice sort of symbiotic relationship between the work and the film and other projects because I could be like, okay, here's 2 minute idea that I sketched for the film. We didn't end up using it, but I still think it sounds cool. So let me take that and then use that in my concert piece, and then it can have a life there. And I've done that a lot with some of that material, and so I really liked that dynamic. That felt very organic and healthy, just as far as like a creative process. So that was another way that the two connected um, pretty much right away. Actually, yeah,
It's neat to hear that you're generating all of these ideas that don't even ultimately get used, but they
yeah,
kind of slip and slide into other
yeah,
things that you're
yeah,
crafting and creating. I feel like that analysis paralysis thing is very real for all creative fields.
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
totally,
very real.
yeah.
And you're not second guessing yourself and being able to have that sort of idea generation machine thing on your side is maybe sometimes kind of helpful.
Totally helpful. It really, I think, frees you up when you're just like you can't worry about the perfect thing. I have a visitor you might see in the background. um, it's my daughter Hazel. I'm not
Oh,
sure
cute
if you see
visitor. Hi, Hazel.
but oh, she wants to go to dinner. Oh, I'm so sorry. Um,
Hey, we
but
can't that.
yeah, I to just answer your question, I think exactly like when you're not focused on, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You need to just generate things. It's a step in a process, and that really freed me up, and being a part of a team too. In a way frees you up too because you're like you're not the only. It's like I sometimes was thinking about it like they're an editor almost. I mean, they're
Mhm.
more. They're the director. They're gonna decide what's good, what's gonna go in or out. But a lot of times it felt like this almost editorial process where I would send them something, especially when we were honing in, especially when they're like, "Yeah, this is good. This is the right direction." Now it's like, maybe there's too much activity here, or maybe like this color. I really felt like, oh, is this what it's like when a writer has an editor and like they help you make it a better version of your own thing? I was like, this is amazing. I want an editor all the time, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, the right collaborators will do magical things.
Yeah, I absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I mean, we would love to ask just so people know too, what is next for you? What can we
Sure.
expect from you?
Yeah.
There's so much on your bio to dig into. I think I saw something about you maybe composing for a ballet. Is that?
Yeah, that was a thing I did in the fall, which was a really
Oh,
cool
okay.
project. I finished that ballet. I collaborated with a choreographer and we wrote a ballet together, and that was awesome. I loved working on that. What's next for me? I've got some commissions, like some pieces that I'm writing, more in the contemporary classical world. I'm writing like a sort of string orchestra piece right now, and then I'm writing like a piece for ensemble and voice. But I also have the soundtrack just came out. I, I I have some album projects that I expect to come out in the next year, not immediately. So, but yeah, so a lot of things are in the works. But I would love it if people checked out this soundtrack. I'm really proud of the music. It's I'm so happy that I was able to release the album because as much as I loved the film, just the reality of mixing soundtrack into film is that you have to make compromises. Things that they need to hear the dialogue, whatnot. But with the album, it's there in the pristine form that I really all the details are there. So I'm really proud of the album. I think it just you can hear the music exactly how I would want it to sound.
Yeah, and it's available on streaming, and
Yeah.
you can hear Robert's grandma's Hawaiian slide guitar.
Yes, you can. That can be the little Easter egg. Go to the Chaplin
Yeah.
studio, you can hear that. Yeah. So,
And then
anyway,
for those that don't know, I think we touched on this, but where can you watch the Real Charlie
the
Chaplin?
film. Okay, yeah, so I know that in the States, it's on Showtime, which I believe is folded into Paramount Plus streaming
Yeah,
service.
you just have to have, like, the premium subscription.
Exactly. I made this mistake. I was telling someone who lives in Canada, and they were like, "That's not true in Canada." So, I don't know about not outside of the States, but in the US, I know through Paramount Plus, you can stream this. Of course, I think you can rent it on Amazon if you wanna just do that. But if you happen to have Paramount Plus or Showtime, it's just up there for streaming. And it's a good film. I really really, check it out. If you're not a Charlie Chaplin fan, it's still actually a good film. It's if you are or you aren't, I think it's a great thing to watch. Cool thing to watch.
Yeah, as a fan, I did enjoy it.
That's great. I'm glad.
I have the box set with City Lights and
Oh,
Modern
you
Times as
are a
well.
big fan. Nice, nice. I'm glad actually you enjoyed it as a big fan. I mean, I have to admit, I did read like all of the reviews of the films. Most of them were very positive, but some of them, there were a couple of ones that were less positive that were like from these like really hardcore Chaplin fans who are
Right.
basically making the point of like, there's nothing new here. Like, "Bah." Like that's not really the point of this.
Yeah, I
Like,
think that might be on them.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
They've gone too deep.
yeah. Anyway,
No, the reviews of this they're all really glowing and for good reason, so
yeah,
great thing to stream, whether you're, really into Chaplin or whether I think you're just trying to access more about him and his films and his work.
yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I really appreciate it. It was nice to talk to you. It was a great conversation. Thanks for your thoughtful questions. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. We were really excited to talk to you. The soundtrack is great.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, maybe hopefully in some years' times I can talk about another soundtrack. We'll see.
Yeah, we'd love to do that
Yeah,
too.
we hope so. It was wonderful to meet you and pleasure to chat with you, and, we'll get you to dinner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I
Great.
have a 6-year-old who will be very happy to hear that we're going to do.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.